lot of good. This would have been good YouTube content.
Yeah, we'll regurgitate it into the.
We always start these YouTube videos like, man, it was either glad that wasn't live or that should have been live.
We could just be making it up every week. No one knows.
Never know. No one will know. Except the server, wherever
and our FBI agents
stores everything. Yeah. The NSA is.
They're definitely watching us.
I'm sure they'll be very interested in this episode. Yeah,
they're taking diligent notes for the I Am Cuba episode. So, all right, we'll do Andrew and then Michael for the order.
Okay.
In 3, 2, 1. And welcome to episode 415 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Andrew Swafford,
Michael O'Malley.
In today's eepisode, we're going to be talking about movies that we saw this week in part 1. And in part 2, we're going to continue our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1964's Soy Cuba, or for us capitalists, I Am Cuba.
Capitalists don't know how to speak Spanish. It is true.
They don't. This episode brought to you by Pabst Blue Ribbon. Pabst Blue Ribbon is a big supporter of Cinematary. I have
Union made.
Exactly, and I have Pabst Blue Ribbon on our sponsorship. They said, "What are you talking about? We don't know what this is. Is it a podcast? We are not interested. ... Stop contacting me." Pabst Blue Ribbon, proud sponsor of the Cinematary podcast. But let's go ahead. I sound like I'm bringing an endorsement to me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into movies we saw this week. And O'Malley, I'm gonna kick it off with you.
Yeah, I didn't actually see this movie this week.
Really?
Full disclosure, in the interest of honesty, I wouldn't want to deceive our listeners. I watched this movie a few weeks ago, but I've not been watching movies recently that often because I was out of town. But this is probably the best movie I've seen recently, which is The Hole, which is a 1998 film directed by Simon Lang. Yeah, big ol', especially in his later career, big ol' slow cinema dude, I'm led to believe. But I've not actually seen his later films. I've seen Goodbye Dragon Inn, and I've also seen
slow.
That is very slow. I forgot about that for a second. And then I saw Rebels of the Neon God, which is not that slow. And then I saw this movie, The Hole, which is maybe in terms of slowness in between the two, but it's not really like either of those movies, except for the wetness, I guess. Goodbye Dragon Inn is a very rainy movie, and The Hole is a very rainy movie too. So what The Hole is it is a movie that takes place in a futuristic Taiwan. Not that futuristic. It's at the end of the millennium, so 1999, and then going into the year 2000. So the far off future of Y2K. And in this far off future, a disease has spread throughout Taiwan, and the area has become partitioned between people who are infected and people who are not. And the people who are infected have to stay in this part of the city. And the disease is weird because it makes you think that you're a cockroach. And so you always try to crawl into dark spaces.
Oh, no.
And at the same time, there are people who didn't leave the partition when they created it. And so there's uninfected people in this place as well, which are our protagonists. And they're holed up in their apartment, kind of quarantined. There is they're neighbors, basically, top and bottom floor neighbors. So the dude lives on top, and then down in one floor below, immediately below his apartment, is this lady. And they're basically just chilling in their apartments for the most part, or their apartment building. They walk around a little bit, and just kind of weathering this emergency. And they're watching the news and listening to the radio and seeing what's going on in the outside world, but they're not really leaving their home and it's also raining torrentially. Like there's some sort of climate thing that's gone on where all of a sudden it's raining and will never stop. And so their apartment is like leaking and it's kind of gross because of that. And also because their apartment is bad and crumbling, a hole forms between their two apartments so they can kind of talk to one another. And that's kind of the premise of the movie, is these two people who are trapped more or less and have been abandoned by their government and have been kind of alienated from those around them because the other people think they're cockroaches. They can talk to each other through this little hole. And
Pyramus and Thisbe adaptation.
It ends better than Pyramus and Thisbe.
That's
spoilers. But yeah, I thought this movie was great. Really, really good. One is part of the grand tradition of art films that are just relentlessly moist all the time. So you've got like Tarkovsky's Stalker. You've got the other Simon Ming movie I mentioned, Goodbye Dragon Inn. You've got like on the more like blockbustery side of like quote unquote art films, you've got like Blade Runner, right? This is like a grand tradition, and it does it great. The movie has just this tactile feel to it that I love. It's all grimy and the rain's coming down. So like a lot of slow cinema or slow cinema adjacent things, it has a kind of ASMR quality because a lot of it's very quiet and you hear the rain. But there's also this kind of intensely sad desperation at the core of it too, because these people are like as alienated from society as you can get, right? Like the government doesn't recognize them. Their peers don't recognize them, and all they have is to cling to each other through this little hole where they can talk. And another thing too, the pipes are bursting, and so the guy's toilet will flush into her apartment, which is also gross, and so he has to like learn to like pee in a bucket instead of flushing the apartment because he's a nice guy. So there's all this kind of gross stuff going on, and that is just like really exquisitely rendered. It's a very vibey movie. My son, who's 3, was watching this with me, and he was just kind of like zoning out because it's like that kind of movie where you can do that, especially if it's subtitled and you don't realize how depressing everything is because you can't read subtitles. But ultimately, it's not a depressing. I mean, it is depressing, but ultimately, it's a very sweet movie about these two people connecting, and that is kind of, I think, sweet. And I thought it was kind of moving, these people's relationships. And like, it's impossible to watch this movie now and not think of like coronavirus quarantine. Like, and I don't know how this movie would have felt to me if I had watched it, like, I don't know, like April of 2020 or something. It may have been like too close to home, but upon reflection, now that we're all, just pretending like this coronavirus thing is gone, and society is quote unquote normal now. It really, I think, does effectively capture that feeling of isolation, that feeling of you're not sure like who you can interact with without like risking, disease. That feeling of, being alienated from the government because it has kind of like created a caste system in terms of like who it gives, recognition to. It's obviously kind of silly in some ways, the cockroach thing, but in terms of like the emotional landscape of weathering like that quarantine season, like I think it resonated a lot. And I think even beyond that, like it's a movie about how two people who are alienated find each other and can have like a meaningful human connection, even though the rest of the world has kind of deprived them of that. And so like, I don't know, COVID notwithstanding, I think it is still really meaningful and moving movie. So it's good. I recommend it.
How disturbing is the cockroach stuff?
You don't see a ton of it, but I mean, people are, it kind of looks silly a little bit. Like this is a movie that's it has some laughs in it, and it's like a satire in a lot of ways. So some of this is like kind of meant to be funny. it's not disturbing in and of itself. Like you just see these people like scurrying under boxes or something, like on hands and knees. But like conceptually, you know that like, oh, this is serious because these people like can't be in light anymore because they'll be, they always want to run away from it. So I don't know. I mean, it looks silly, but by the end of the movie, once you're kind of into the vibe and into like the world that this movie is, when you start seeing people like that, it just is sad.
Yeah. This is one of the Simon Lang movies I've not seen, so I need to check it out at some point.
It's worth a watch.
Yeah, just go find yourself a dark corner and tune it on.
It would be like, I don't have a very like elaborate like movie watching setup at my house, but if you have like some sort of like dark room with like really good sound system, you know, where you can just shut out the outside world and just be completely enveloped by this movie, it's the kind of movie that I think would really benefit from that.
I'm sure.
And it is not like, if people are scared of slow cinema, or if you've seen Goodbye Dragon Inn, for instance, which is like very slow, this is not quite that. This is maybe more on the Stalker end of things, but it's like half the length of Stalker. So yeah, it's pretty engaging, I thought.
Cool. And where'd you watch it?
A library DVD. So check your local library, or I think it's on Criterion, maybe?
It is not a Criterion.
Dang.
Letterboxd says there is no way to stream it. So,
well, that's a lie, I'm
no
sure.
way.
So, you know, hit up your local YouTube or Daily Motion site, and maybe they'll have it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to shift us over to a widely different set of films, and that is, I'm going to talk about 2 early Adam McKay movies as I watch.
I don't see them as that different.
As I watch Adam McKay movies from when Adam McKay was good. All right. First one, Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy. This one, out of, I think most of them, definitely has the most zeitgeist. Definitely has the most zeitgeist kind of permeating qualities of it. It's not super. It's really not super dated, because a lot of the humor about the 4 guys, Will Ferrell, Paul Rudd, Steve Carell, and David Kushner, being super sexist to Christina Applegate is the point of the movie.
Is it a movie about workplace harassment? Is that the satire?
It's a little bit of that, a little bit of just like it also, and this is, I'll probably get into it more when I watch Anchorman 2. It's also just a kind of a media commentary as well. So it's more about like the, you know, having more women on television news rather than it just being like Walter Cronkite and people of that nature. Just extremely exaggerated.
Is there anything about it that feels very true as a person who works in news?
No.
Bad satire.
No, well, it's more of satire. It does kind of hit on like the push for kind of diversity as just kind of putting signing the person and going, oh, we got a diverse hire, and then not utilizing them at all. Which I think is kind of apt, because they like hire the Christina Applegate character, and then just I forgot what the first story is that they give her. It's like a chicken, like somebody chasing a chicken around town, and they just kind of like dump her to these terrible stories. It also, you know, when they're talking about diversity, opens up for the great Ron Burgundy line where they're like, you know, Ron, do you know what diversity is? And he's like, I think diversity is an old steamship back from the Civil War. But no, it still holds up. I need to watch the second one. The second one is super funny. I think it might be better than the first one. Really? And it also has a great searing satire of media, but like it's making fun of like the 24-hour news cycle, and more. And it gets more into like new media compared to what it's spoofing here in the 70s. But this one, it still holds up. There's still, I mean, I don't know. I like Will Ferrell. He can be he can also be obnoxious, but he's generally pretty entertaining. And in this one, he definitely like this character is like fully formed, and it's become its own thing. You know, he even had like a podcast for a while where he was playing Ron Burgundy.
What?
Yeah, that went on for like years.
What?
Yeah, look it up.
Was he commenting on the news like Stephen Colbert did?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of Colbert Report-ish. It's not spoofing like a specific, like a right wing or left wing type thing like Colbert was doing. It's more just spoofing. It's more spoofing like the personality, the media personality. I mean, and I think it kind of gets to some satire there. Even today when you have like the Rachel Maddow's and the Anderson Coopers and the Tucker Carlsons, like these like, you know, people who are in front of the screen that you're like, yeah, I know them. This one is more spoofing to like the Walter Cronkite, like that era of people as well, and kind of just like making this like larger than life personality who people just have this you know, complete trust in as this news personality. Like one of the funny traits that he has is whatever is on the teleprompter he will read. And so that leads to like his downfall, because instead of saying "Stay classy, San Diego," which is his sign off line, the Christina Applegate character, they bribe the person to change it to "Fuck you, San Diego,"
or is it "Go fuck yourself, San Diego"?
Yeah, go fuck yourself, San Diego. So he's like, "Go fuck yourself, San Diego." And he's like, da-dun, da-dun, da-dun. And he's like doing like the end of the news stuff. It's great. But no, it's still funny. I think I don't think it's lost a little bit of it just because it's so kind of in pop culture to a degree now that there's a lot of lines in it that really just don't have that are just kind of neutered because they've been used so often.
For a while, I love lamp was a thing that people liked to say.
Yeah.
That's a weird thing to quote. Doesn't make any sense out of context.
But honestly, the best scenes it has. Well, one, it gets even like more absurd in the second one. But the fight between all the news channels is still great.
That is funny.
Like just a great scene. Because you start with the Vince Vaughn led news channel, and then there's the Luke Wilson channel who like they cut off his arm, and then like in the last scene he's like doing the news with the one arm, and they like pull off. So then he just has no arms. He's like trying to do it's stupid. And then they have like Tim Robbins is the PBS station. And they keep asking for pledges, and then they have Ben Stiller like in like complete manic Ben Stiller mode as like the Hispanic news channel, and then they just have this insane, you know, incredibly stupid fight where people are like getting killed and stuff, and it's just these news anchors. That's a great scene.
Ben Stiller playing a Hispanic character.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah.
He could be from Spain.
What's that?
He could be from Spain. They're white Spanish speakers.
Hold on, let's look it up.
I think Ben Stiller.
No, I don't mean Ben Stiller himself, but like his character could be European.
Sure.
I mean, he's not Hispanic.
He's not Hispanic.
in the whatchamadoodgee, the whole course of the stupidity of the news anchor fight, it's kind of fits in about how absurd it does. And I'll probably talk about it when I watch the second one. It does like get to this level of absurdity with that one, because you have like, what is it? Yeah, like Will Smith is like ESPN News. You have like Kanye West is there as like MTV News. My favorite is John C. Reilly is playing the ghost of Stonewall Jackson for whatever reason. you have and he's brought back to life through the History Channel, who the lead anchor is Liam Neeson. Like, it's but the Anchorman solid. I don't know if I think it's a little overblown as like being one of his better ones, but I do think this one right here, Talladega Nights, Ballad, Ricky Bobby, is fantastic. this is a weird one. I think it kind of got labeled as stupider than what it is. I think people kind of buy in that it is this kind of like lowbrow comedy that kind of feeds into the audience it's kind of making fun of, which is unfair because it's 100% really making fun of this audience. Because and I saw a Letterboxd review that said that Talladega Nights spoofs the Bush administration better than Vice does, and that's 100% true. You just have like it's a movie that's just coursing with excess. Like I think the best example of it is when Ricky Bobby, who's the Will Ferrell character, they're having dinner at the dinner table, and his wife, who's played by Leslie Bibb, and he has the two kids who are just cussing everything out, and the grandpa, and like the dinner is set up. There's like Powerade and Mountain Dew like on the table. They're passing around like Domino's, but like Domino's pizza, but they have like the individual plate of Domino's. You have like they have all the different like logos on everything. I think he's wearing like a Powerade jacket. And it's just like it's honestly it's incredible, like as this kind of commentary on not just like NASCAR racing or anything like that, but just like there's not too many moments where you're not inundated with just brands and like patriotism and all of this. And I think it really does get to the heart of just how like, and because the whole point of the movie is that like Ricky Bobby is this incredible NASCAR driver. He has everything he wants. But then he has this accident when he's trying to beat the French Formula One driver who's played by Sacha Baron Cohen. And kind of like loses his groove, and then everything else, like he loses his wife, he loses all his sponsorships, he's off the team and all this kind of stuff. And it does kind of get into like the shallowness, the vapidness of not only just like a NASCAR driver, but just any sort of like celebrity of this magnitude. It could be, somebody like a Lionel Messi in soccer. It could be somebody like Tom Brady in football, just like who is like this larger than life, icon figure. And it could even be just like celebrities, and just there is just kind of this soullessness in the whole thing. It's not perfect. I don't think it kind of gets a little bit lost in the second half of the movie when he's like trying to kind of work his way back to kind of NASCAR fame, even though it does introduce Gary Cole as his dad, who has like early in the movie, he tells Ricky, he's like, if you ain't first, you're last. And then like as an adult, he's like, but Dad, that's what you told me, that like I've been living my life but like that. And he's like, Ricky, I was high. You can be first, you can be second, you can be third. Hell, you can be fourth. After he gets kicked out of an Applebee's during dinner, which is just like the whole sentence is just great. But no, I think this movie has a little bit more going on than it probably is given credit for. John C. Reilly is pretty wonderful in this movie. It's just like this, as like his kind of second, his best friend and second in command at one point. So the whole thing in the movie is that because they're going to get rid of Ricky, they put John C. Reilly's character, who's Carl Naughton Jr., as like the new race car driver. And so because of that, Ricky's wife leaves him for John C. Reilly. And then like it starts this whole thing where Ricky's like, I don't want to be friends with you anymore. But John C. Reilly continues, like, just because he's like, he like calls and checks in all the time. He's like, why am I even talking to you? And he's just like, they have this whole like subplot where there's like a ghost in his house, and they don't really follow through with it, which sounds hilarious. but no, he's just great. I'm really excited to the next two Adam McKay movies. Are probably two of my favorites of him. The first one is Step Brothers, which is an incredible satire of like gig economy and the millennial workforce. And then The Other Guys from 2010, which is just which I think probably from top to bottom I laugh at the most. And then I think then Anchorman 2 before we start getting into like serious cinema.
Thought or question about Talladega Nights as satire.
Mhm.
I feel like I've heard this movie quoted most often by the people that it's satirizing.
Yeah.
Do you think that, like, how does that kind of calculate into our evaluation of how good of satire it is? If the people that it's satirizing don't get it or don't know what's being said about them, like, does that make it better because it's sneakier, or worse because it's not like communicating effectively?
Well, I don't think the satire like the people who it's satirizing necessarily have to like. It's not like they're going to be like, "Ah, well, you know,
I never.
yeah, like you think of like Life of Brian, like we're Christians, like watching that and watching that like without any knowledge, and to be like, well, bless my stars.
Mhm.
I think that it is sneakier than you think, because if you listen to like he's constantly talking about stuff in a way that would appeal to the type of person that it's satirizing, but he
Mhm.
says it in such a and he does and they do the same thing, and I think this is the kind of key to Adam McKay through all these movies is he does it in a subtle way, because of like the kind of like small nuances of the comedy that make it that you realize, oh no, he's making fun of that. It's which kind of is what's interesting to me, because he loses all that subtlety in his last three movies, and it's kind of like the satires there just like slapping you in the face.
Mhm.
Which I feel like which I mean, I would feel like is more ineffective. You think about like Vice or something like that. It's just an ineffective movie.
Right.
So I think it's tough. I don't know. I think like in a perfect world, you would want the people that they're satirizing to be like, well, they got me. I need to change my ways, but that's never going to happen. So.
That's true. And I do prefer a too subtle Adam McKay to a too on the nose Adam McKay.
Yeah, well, it becomes less insightful, but just becomes more of like him going like being a know-it-all the entire time. So,
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's also like, even if I don't know, there's something about the comedy, despite even though it is also part of the satire, like even if the satire is not like 100% connecting all the time, it's at least still funny, which is not something you can say about like these other movies that he's made, where it's like, oh, the satire is kind of not so good, but at least it's funny. Like, I don't know, I haven't seen Vice, but my impression is it's not very funny.
There's no way.
It's not. I remember watching and just being like, this is just like, it's a weird lecture. Why am I having this lecture? But I don't know. But yeah, that's Talladega Nights and Anchorman. I think they're worth, if you want a silly movie, they're very silly movies. All right. Well, I think a perfect lead into part 2 is going to come from Andrew. So I'm going to.
That's true.
Oh,
here's another silly movie for you. I watched Steven Soderbergh's Che, otherwise known as Che Part 1 and Che Part 2. These are two movies that are both fairly long in and of themselves. They're both like 2 hours and 20 minutes. So it's like the majority of a Satan tango that you're sitting through this biopic of Che Guevara, played by Benicio del Toro extremely well. His performance is probably my favorite thing about both of these movies. But these are both like contained stories about specific events in his life. Part 1 is, of course, about the Cuban Revolution. And part 2 is about his involvement in a failed Bolivian revolution that I actually did not know a lot about. One of the reasons why I watched these movies in the first place is just because I wanted to know more about Cuba, and specifically like how that like power, that change of the power structure happened there. Especially because like it's really hard to, I was going to say it's hard to like get what feels like accurate information about countries like Cuba or Russia or China and the United States. But this is of course a American movie by an American filmmaker. Surprisingly though, it is both almost entirely in Spanish, which I don't think most like blockbuster filmmakers or people who make like movies at the level that Steven Soderbergh does.
This was like his clout movie after the Oceans, right? Like,
yeah. So like,
love it.
Somebody who does an Oceans movie then makes like 4.5 hours of like Spanish language Che Guevara, apologia, I guess it would be one way to put it. It's very sympathetic to him and to the cause. It doesn't go into like a lot of like theory behind the political push that Che was part of, but it does allow him plenty of opportunity to speak. The first movie is intercut between him making military moves in Cuba and him speaking at the United Nations and being interviewed by like CBS News and stuff like that. And some of the most effective parts of the movie are when you're seeing those things at the same time. You're watching the military action while you're hearing some of the justification or like explanation from Jay. Now, I will say that this movie or these movies have a pretty big drawback for me, which is that they just don't feel like they earn their length to me. I mean, there's a way in which I can see why they are as long as they are. They're about process, like the slow tedium of like building an army. Like this is kind of a surreptitious political movement that he's a part of, and it has to like creep through the jungle, like picking up people here and there on their way to do this coup, essentially. And so like the day-to-day life of these revolutionaries is pretty uneventful. They're not getting into battles at every turn. They're being sneaky and they're trying to go undetected. But in a 2.5 hour movie where you're not really getting a lot of plot to hold on to or a lot of characters that are particularly vividly drawn other than Benicio del Toro's Che, that can get a bit dry, which felt more true once I saw part 2. That does not have any sort of like counterbalancing, intercutting thing. You're just kind of with him in this failed Bolivian revolution until he eventually gets captured and dies. And the action that you're seeing in that movie is pretty similar to the action you're seeing in the first one. There are ways in which they serve as nice little counterpoints to one another because, of course, one was a successful and one was an unsuccessful revolution, and you can kind of see the cracks along the way in the second one. But overall, kind of feel like I would have preferred to just watch maybe one shorter movie than both of these super long ones. I'm also maybe biased because I've never been a huge Steven Soderbergh fan. There are a couple movies of his that I enjoy, but I've never really like been banging the drum for Soderbergh auteurism in the way that I know both of my compatriots on the podcast have. My comrades, yeah. Michael, you have seen both of these, right? Do you want to?
I have. It's been several years, but I've
seen them.
My memory is I liked it. My memory is similar to yours, though, in that I found the first one more engaging, but I liked it overall. And he's like kind of entering this phase, like after he did the Oceans movies, after he did this movie, he went into this, like, I mean, he kind of goes in and out of these phases throughout his whole career, but he went into like this highly experimental phase after that, right? Didn't he do like the Girlfriend Experience and stuff like that, like where he's really messing around with digital cinematography a lot? And I remember thinking, I don't remember what like specific details on this, but I remember thinking that like this feels like a transition film into that.
It was apparently one of the first big movies to be shot on the RED cameras, which have now become like industry standard in a lot of ways. So I wonder if it would have looked a little bit more innovative at the time. And now I just like can't see like what's special about the crispness of this image because it's just so everywhere.
I don't know. I mean, if we're thinking about like Soderbergh auteurism, like it makes sense that he would do a biopic of a revolutionary, like if not Che Guevara, then someone else, because like kind of like one of the central thematic projects of his whole filmography is the discussion of like labor and exploitation under capitalism, right? Like that is like a solid through line throughout like most of his career. And this is kind of like his most explicit engagement with that in terms of how people conceptualize that, like the battle between, communism and capitalism. And so it's kind of interesting as that in his filmography as well, in that like this is where he gets to engage with this sort of thing on an explicitly political level, rather than like, let's say like High Flying Bird, right, which is about a labor action, but it's not really framed in terms of like we're talking about politicians, right? It's framed through the entertainment, like a wing of the entertainment complex, right? So those are my thoughts, having not seen the movie in maybe like 5 years or something.
I remember I really liked the kind of the process angle to it got a little tedious in the second half, or the second movie, mainly because you lose Fidel, who like the whole Che and Fidel scenes in the first one are great, as you kind of see like. But I like the process because it kind of digs into any sort of revolution or any sort of like uprising of any sort, like how complicated it can be, even though you have a central idea. Like that's what's so great about the Fidel Che dynamic in the first movie, is because if you like cut through all the bullshit, they're going for the same thing, but they have but they're both of two different minds about it. And you have Fidel, who seems to be kind of endearing himself as the like he's going like I'm like working for the people, but also definitely is much more veering toward the limelight and kind of becoming the face of this, compared to Che, who is just who's more like he's very much in the trenches to a degree in that revolt, which makes the whole second movie that is what kind of makes the second movie a little bit more interesting, because then he's forced to be the figurehead of it to a degree. And you can kind of see where he struggles at that, and it kind of just shows you the imperfections of any sort of result like this, not because they don't make any sense, but because it's just such a fine line to marry all like get all of these egos to kind of coalesce around the one idea. And I think it kind of gets at it in a way that's not condemning it. I don't feel like it's condemning communism at all. It's more just kind of going, it's difficult to get all of these people all on the same page and be able to follow one another. And that's what kind of was interesting to me about it.
And the way that
go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to say, like, it's interesting that you bring up Fidel. He is really the only other like fully realized character other than Che in both of these movies. And so, not having him in part two, it does feel a bit like
hurts.
a loss. But I mean, the lack of him and the fact that Che is kind of going off and doing his own thing is maybe one argument for like why it does need to be two movies, or why it needs to be two stories. Because one thing that I didn't really know about Che Guevara is like the idea that he just like jumped around a lot of different countries and helped with various revolutions, right? He wasn't Cuban. He came to Cuba to help with the revolution because he was just a true believer in the cause. And rather than like stick around and be a political leader, he was like, no, I'm going to go find another country that's on the verge of revolution and help them out. And he kind of does that until he eventually meets his end. But what were you about to say, Michael? Sorry.
Oh, this is something that Zach said a few minutes ago, but like about like how complicated any sort of like movement or revolutionary movement is. And I think about like, so if we think, I've thought a lot about like the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests from 2020. And I think one of the interesting things that comes out of like when you have a big, kind of social, like civil disobedience or like revolutionary movement, it's very easy to say a narrative about it. And like when I think about like what I was taught about history and like movements and that sort of thing. Like there is a very clear narrative, and like I could explain in broad strokes like what that narrative is about Cuba as well, or just like Che Guevara in general. But like it when you get into like, okay, what actually went down and what happened, you start getting into this minutia that is really, it can be tedious at times. Like I listened to a podcast that was like multiple episodes, like hours and hours of someone doing reporting in Portland during the Black Lives Matter protest there in 2020. And a lot of it was really, mundane's not the right word because there was exceptional circumstances, but a lot of it is really like, okay, at 8:55, the police moved to this block and started tear gassing people. Then
it's granular is the word.
Right, exactly. And I remember thinking in the Bolivia part 2, that really captures something like a side of that sort of thing that we never see, which is in the trenches of those sorts of like granular decision making stuff without any of the big picture narrative stuff. Because in part 1, you have intercut with like his UN appearance. It's at the UN, right? Where he's like explaining himself and explaining like what the cause is and that sort of thing. But in the Bolivia one, you don't have that. And it is entirely just like literally in the weeds, right? Because they're out in the wilderness, doing these things. And there is something like interesting and not often portrayed, at least in Western media, about like, what that sort of experience is.
Yeah, for sure. Anything that I could say negative about this movie as a viewing experience, you could easily think of as a positive, kind of like intellectually or philosophically, right? Your mileage is going to vary on whether or not like you kind of lean one way or the other on it. But definitely worth checking out. For sure.
Yeah. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to be talking some more Cuba as we talk about 1964's Soy Cuba after this. This definitely won't be a politically charged part 2.
We'll just be unbiased. The unbiased observer of our neighbors in the Caribbean. It is interesting, like, so the Che movies were 2008, right?
Yeah, they both came out in 08.
I wonder if he had made those a few years later when Obama kind of briefly opened up diplomatic relations with Cuba, if the movie would have been done a little bit differently.
Well, didn't you say he interviewed Fidel?
Not Soderbergh.
Toro did.
Who I think has dual citizenship, if I remember correctly.
Oh, nice.
Maybe not. Not in Cuba, I don't think, but I don't know. I'm talking out of my hat. I don't know what but he went and talked to Fidel and talked to people in Cuba. So however he got there, he talked to people there.
He is Puerto Rican.
He is Puerto Rican, okay.
Yeah. I'll go to the bathroom, y'all. Be right back.
Michael, did you see the trailer for Del Toro's Pinocchio movie?
No, I didn't know it was out. The trailer, I mean.
Yeah, said it. He's doing the stop motion.
Yeah, I'm stoked, man. Have you ever read the original Pinocchio novel?
No.
It's fucking bizarre. Because it's like this. It was like published like as a serial in Italy, I think. And so it's like super episodic, and it's just weird shit. It's got a very like fairy tale vibe to it. But it's like stuff like, so he turns into the donkey like he does in the Disney movie, but apparently it's just like donkey flesh on the outside of him because he gets thrown into the ocean. And like fish come and like devour the donkey flesh off of him, and he's just the puppet again underneath. And there's like other parts where like Pinocchio is like cold, so he sits up close to a fire and his legs get burned off, and so they have to like chop down a tree and build him new legs and stuff. It's really weird shit. He almost gets eaten by this dude who like is like a giant, and he's like a fisherman, so he like fishes him out of the ocean. I don't know. I read it when I was in elementary school because it's like a children's book.
Yeah.
But it's kind of fucked up.
It seems like a little bit on that vibe, but probably not as like disturbing.
Yeah.
But it's definitely got like kind of a dark fairy tale vibe going on in the
Yeah,
trailer.
I would
Looks
hope.
much different than the live action Pinocchio from Robert Zemeckis that he's making for Disney.
I can't believe they're still going through with these. I mean, I guess I can, but just stop.
I just like that it's another like it looks like another unhinged Tom Hanks role. Like Tom Hanks is just in his like
Please give Tom Hanks unhinged roles. Like those are my favorite.
yeah.
Like one of the things that's actually good about the Coen Brothers Lady Killers movie is Tom Hanks.
It's just like yeah.
Like elder statesman Tom Hanks getting questionable roles is a great subgenre.
Yeah. Like I don't know how you can't not enjoy just like whatever the fuck he's doing in Elvis.
I haven't seen Elvis, but he's one of the things I'm interested in.
Yeah, he's just you're just like, what's going on?
Is he supposed to be like Flemish or something? I think I read. Or
yeah, it's just it's wild, honestly. It feels like a lost performance out of like Cloud Atlas that they just dropped.
Yeah.
In this movie. Which Cloud Atlas is just filled with unhinged. Like it's just like let's just put a bunch of unhinged Tom Hanks movie in one movie.
Yeah.
Like nothing can beat New York gangster Tom Hanks throwing somebody off of a balcony during a party.
There's so much in that movie.
And then the whole I watched it recently. It's like I don't know, it's fine. I don't think it's like insanely great. It's entertaining, but like the whole like super apocalyptic one where he's like speaking in like the gibberish language.
Oh, yeah. And they man, just the weird like yellow face on all of them, and that one the other one too. Like that doesn't even like whatever, bad regardless, but it's not even like good makeup.
It's just like an unhinged movie. It's great.
What are we talking about?
Cloud Atlas.
Cloud Atlas.
I have the book and I've
seen
been meaning to read it for years, but Andrew, it is a movie to watch for sure.
Have you not seen it?
I've not. No.
You should watch that. Yeah.
As like just gotta like watch like so like
it's a trope.
After conquering the world with the Ocean's movies, Steven Soderbergh made Shay. Yeah. After conquering the world with the Matrix, these guys made Speed Racer and then this.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's honestly it's the Wachowski sisters as well as Tom Tykwer who did Run Lola Run. It's like this weird it's a wild ass movie. Like it's a wild ass movie.
It is so wild.
It's a good Sunday afternoon. Like let's watch something wild.
Is it the only Wachowski movie I haven't seen? Oh, I haven't seen Jupiter Ascending either.
I've not seen Jupiter Ascending. I think that's the one.
Cloud Atlas is a little bit more fun than that. Jupiter Ascending is less fun. This one has unhinged performances. There's like Hugh Grant is in it, and he plays this role.
Oh my gosh, I forgot Hugh Grant was in
the movie. One of his roles is like a cannibal, like war leader, in like this. Like he's also in the gibberish Tom Hanks post-apocalyptic role thing, but he's like at one point he's just like eating like a body or something. You're like, Jesus Christ, Hugh Grant! Like he goes really into it.
Yeah, it's. Andrew, it's worth a watch, whether or not you feel like it's good. Like it's a good movie to have seen, just to see it.
We'll definitely watch at some point.
Lubricate yourself a little bit and then dive into it.
What the fuck?
Okay.
I think he means intoxicate.
Oh, I was thinking like we were about to dive into like a small hole where you needed to be slide through.
You can use lubricate as a way to be like get a little drunk.
Yeah, I understand that now. But my first thought was, have you seen that episode of Have you seen that episode of The Simpsons where groundskeeper Willie has to like go into the ductwork of the school, and strips himself naked and like greases himself up so he's not gonna get stuck
Do
in the
that.
ductwork. That's Andrew
Do that.
watching Cloud Atlas.
Wow. I will think of that when I watch it.
Please do.
All right, let's talk about some Cuba. Let's go to the party with the obnoxious dubbed Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, those Americans were
I
beautifully.
loved it. It was like
That's
it was like RRR level Americans. It was just
Yeah, it
let's
was
make
like-
them absurd.
they're so obnoxious that
I
like
loved it.
that's what the movie uses in part to justify the revolution. Is like
Yep.
these dudes are fucking annoying.
And you're like, yeah, they are.
It's true.
Okay. Here we go. In 3, 2, 1. And we're back with part 2 of episode 415 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be continuing our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1964's Soy Cuba, directed by Mikhail Kalatozov, from a script by Enrique Pineda Barnett and Yevgeny Yevtusenko. I think I'm going to go with that.
Now, we don't have Russian names on this show very often.
No. The film stars Sergio Corriere, Salvador Wood, Jose Gallardo, Jean Busset, and Luis Maria Calazo. A study in contrast set in and around Havana that explores Cuba's 1959 revolution. A young woman's fascination with the excess of an American-owned casino leads to her downfall in the eyes of her street vendor boyfriend. A tenant farmer revolts the only way he knows how, attacking the land he works. University students gain firsthand knowledge of political upheaval. And in the hills outside the city, the members of a poor peasant family are patriotically swept up into the burgeoning revolt. Shortly after the 1959 Cuban Revolution overthrew the United States-backed dictatorship of Batista, the socialist Castro government, isolated by the United States after the latter broke diplomatic and trade relations in 1961, turned to the USSR in many areas, including for film partnerships. The Soviet government, interested in promoting international socialism and perhaps in need to further familiarize itself with its new ally, agreed to collaborate with the Instituto Cubano del Arte y Industria Cinematográfico and finance a film about the Cuban Revolution. Produced by Mosfilm and ICAIC, the film was started only a week after the Cuban Missile Crisis and was designed to be Cuba's answer to both Sergei Eisenstein's propaganda masterpiece, Battleship Potemkin, and Jean-Luc Godard's freewheeling romance, Breathless. You know, two movies that are very much the same. The director was given considerable freedom to complete the work and was given much help from both the Soviet and Cuban governments. The film was made use of many innovative techniques, such as coating a watertight camera's lens with a special submarine periscope cleaner so the camera could be submerged and lifted out of the water without any drops on the lens or film. At one point, more than 1,000 Cuban soldiers were moved to a remote location to shoot one scene, this despite the then ongoing Cuban Missile Crisis. In another scene, the camera follows a flag over a body held higher on a stretcher along a crowded street. Then it stops and slowly moves upward for at least 4 stories until it is filming the flagged body from above a building. Without stopping, it then starts tracking sideways and enters through a window into a cigar factory, then goes straight towards a rear window where the cigar workers are watching the procession. The camera finally passes through the window and appears to float along the middle of the street between the buildings. These shots were accomplished by the camera operator having the camera attached to his vest, like an early crude version of a Steadicam. And the camera operator was also wearing a vest with hooks on the back. An assembly line of technicians would hook and unhook the operator's vest to various pulleys and cables that span floors and building rooftops. Cinematographer Sergei Urasevsky, in a 1965 interview on the film, said, quote, "We saw the film as a kind of poem, as poetic narrative. I'm not saying that this is how it has actually turned out. What did seem absolutely necessary to us was the creation of an image, to the point of hyperbole. We tried to get to the point where the viewer would not be just a passive observer of events happening on the screen, but would experience them with the actor. I, as a cameraman, always wanted to do more than simply fixate what was happening in front of the camera. I'm interested in getting the basic themes of the scene: love, loathing, misery, joy, despair. Rhythm is the key." I Am Cuba was shown briefly in Cuba and the USSR in 1964 and incurred the wrath of both Castro and Khrushchev. It wasn't released in any other countries and vanished, but after 3 decades, the film surfaced without subtitles at the 1992 Telluride Film Festival tribute to Kalatozov. The director lived to see its triumphant resurrection only months before his death. Under the auspices of Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese, Milestone Film and Video have added subtitles and put it into general release. And so during that re-release in 1995, the LA Times said, I Am Cuba concludes in the ruggedly beautiful Sierra Maestra with tremendous cumulative power as a peasant casts his lot with Castro's guerrillas. In this post-Soviet era, however, the idealistic zeal that fuels all of this fiery film takes on a cast that's truly tragic. Ann Ebert, 1995, said, I Am Cuba is an anti-American propaganda film made as a Cuban-Soviet co-production that has been snatched from oblivion, restored, and released in the United States. Since the film's prediction of a brave new world under Fidel Castro has not resulted in a utopia for Cubans who suffer under one of the world's most dismal bureaucracies, the film today seems naive and dated, but fascinating.
Wow. Roger Ebert.
CIA asset.
Yeah. I wonder why Castro didn't like the movie, because the last act is just like, here's why it was cool that people joined Castro's army.
I wonder if, having been through the revolution, seeing it depicted, I don't know. I imagine when I see things that I've experienced or been through, like this is not
reductive.
This is not analogous at all, Andrew, except for this very specific aspect. But like, when you see movies set in a school, like half of the time, don't they set your teeth on edge because it's like, you know,
Absolutely.
that may have like created a good narrative, but it's not right.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can see that.
So I believe this was the first time for everybody watching this.
Yeah.
Just let's just kind of dive in on it. I spent part of the notes just expounding on the sequence with the procession and that whole
cigar factory and everything.
Because I like paused the movie because I was like, how the fuck did they just do that?
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of how the fuck did they just do that moments in this
Constantly.
movie.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
But what did you all take from it?
I think that was like one of the first things that stood out to me, is because I had seen the director's 2 other famous movies, which are Letter Never Sent and
The Cranes Are Flying.
The Cranes Are Flying, right?
Yeah.
And so I kind of knew a little bit of like what his thing was. But that said, like, I'm used to when I see films that came out of like Soviet bloc, or like, I guess in this case Cuba, but Soviets were involved. Like when I see films that come out of that, like there's a certain like I don't expect to see like really flashy like theatrics like with the camera and film style like this movie had, and I was just kind of like blown away the whole time, especially because it opens with like its most energetic sequence in the club, right? And it's like cross-cutting with all this like dancing and all that sort of stuff, and I was just immediately immersed and just captivated by the just the energy of the film style and like the inventiveness, like the constant new ways of depicting things that I thought was just super cool. And I don't know if this is the case since this movie was not widely seen in the US, but it feels like I gotta feel like Martin Scorsese and Paul Thomas Anderson specifically are like drawing on this movie heavily with like some of their like 90s and 2000s movies.
I think I've heard Paul Thomas Anderson cite it. Yeah. For the scene in Boogie Nights where like the camera goes under the water of the pool.
Yeah.
Well, and I can see Scorsese like in scenes from like even like his early stuff like Mean Streets and things like that, where like you just kind of have this congestion in like a bar or something. He also kind of moves around, like there's a lot of scenes with like De Niro where he's just moving around places that kind of, it doesn't have like the exact same energy, but you can kind of see the technique following the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. And like the fact that this is in the 1960s, like early 60s, or I guess mid 60s, and you mentioned in your write up, Zach, about how like some of it appears to be done like what you would use Steadicam for, decades later, but they're kind of jerry rigging something that functions similarly. And I, even with like, movies that are flashier, like just the acrobatics that the camera goes through at times in this movie are just like jaw dropping considering the era in which it was filmed.
Well, I was reading about how they filmed the sequence where the farmers he just found out that they're taking the farm away, and he's like chopping up the
Yeah.
sugar cane.
Mm-hmm.
And he used this like the cinematographer used like this infrared lens because it really like brought out the white of the sugar cane with like the sun and everything. And so his goal was to make it look like when he starts just kind of cutting like crazy, it's supposed to give the appearance that like the sugar cane around him that's like all over him, like it's like swords in different directions. So he's just like caught in like this mess of swords as he's cutting away. And like they had like a GIF in the article of the scene. You're like, yeah, when you kind of think of it from that perspective, it's just like he's like just engulfed by all of these plants, and it's just like sitting there trying to chop his way out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of my takeaway for the most part. Like the narratives are honestly the narratives are to a degree are kind of whatever to me. It's more about this movie does to a degree it's a very strongly wordless movie because it really just kind of sets you. It's one of the better movies I've seen lately that really just sets you in a place, like whether you're in the mountains or whether you're in a club. You feel all of the tangible qualities of being in that place, regardless of whether you're following the plot that's happening there.
Well, in the first story that happens where you start in the club and then they walk out of the club and like walk into like away from it into a slum or something like that. Like there's just such an incredible like the sense of place is used to the film's ends, right? Like you have the contrast of like the capitalist owned club versus the kind of like poor and like disenfranchised thing, and it's done in not in one shot, but it's done in a sequence in which you can see when she leaves one and enters the other, and
every individual space you're in, you usually get a long shot just like walking through the entire space, so you get a sense of like the architecture of the place that you're in. Especially, you mentioned earlier, Michael, that first sequence where we're like up on the rooftop bar and like we keep going to like a level below and then a level below that as the camera is like doing all these impossible moves. I actually didn't recognize at first that that's like the intro to the first story. I thought of it as like its own standalone wordless sequence because the movie also starts with a long like narrativeless sequence where we have the camera in like a helicopter or something, just gliding over the treetops for a really, really long time. And then we're like down in the river, like on the water level, like following this guy on a boat very slowly as you're like listening to a poem be read.
Oh God, that whole sequence
incredible.
Was incredible too.
Yeah,
that's what sucked me in actually before even the party sequence was just was just the guy paddling the boat and you're in like he's having to go under like kind of the structures, the bridges and stuff, but then the cameras like fall. Oh, it's just great.
And like honestly, I would have been fine if the movie would have just kept doing that. Like if it was just a collection of cool images and like cool like visual experiences that gave you a sense of like what Cuba is like on a vibes level, as opposed to these moral stories or these politically charged like fables. I would have been fine with that too. And I'm not complaining about the politically charged fables. It's good agitprop, right? I like how all these different stories kind of serve as this patchwork, and they all are like talking about the same things, even though like in their actual specifics. Like they don't have anything to do with each other, but they're kind of about these broader forces of like money and military might and things like that, and how they screw over ordinary people. But like you were saying, Zach, the way the movie shines the most is just like in the sheer visual inventiveness of it. And like I don't need a character or a story to follow to just like be engrossed by what I can see and what the camera is doing.
I think it's cool too because, I mean, Cuba was, before the, I don't know, like socialist revolution, like it was a colonized place, and the movie shows that with like the club and like with the bombings with the United Fruit Company, I think makes an appearance. And one of the things that often happens with like colonization is that the place itself is devalued, except in as much as it is able to have resources extracted from it. So like you have the club, which is only there to make money that can be taken from like, the folks here or from tourists or whoever. And that money leaves Cuba or stays with like the rich owner, wherever they live. And one of the kind of cool things about this movie is that all of this visual care often goes toward presenting like the landscapes of Cuba apart from capitalist or Western intervention or the colonized aspects of Cuba. There's like a national pride in like the Cuba that is not represented by like a colonized, authority. And I think that that's like a kind of cool, like implicit thing in the project of the movie is like, Soy Cuba is not just like in those poems that get read, at different points, like, it's as almost as if like in like, the kind of like, Western capitalist version of Cuba that internationally was known. That's not Cuba. Like Soy Cuba is like these farmers or these landscapes that like you would never go in if you were a tourist, not from Cuba. Like there's something like really cool about the way that the camera itself captured, like the visuals kind of suck in all of this like Cuban identity, and makes it beautiful and something to be proud of. And I think that's neat.
Well, it gives everything the same treatment. So like it's not it's funny. Like I wouldn't say that the movie's just like, it's predominantly Castro propaganda, but it also is kind of just like, like these are also the other facets of Cuba, like these people out on the farm who are just living their damn life. I like that they're handled with like if anything, the most like socialist ideal you feel in the movie is the use of the camera, because the camera shoots the poor farmers as beautifully and as engagingly as they do the the rich people at the club or the people on the streets in Havana. Like I mean, because it's very there's no class system within how the camera is utilized, and I think that's what also is effective. Kind of to your point, Michael, about the movie.
Yeah.
The one big topic that I do think we should spend some time on is just the concept of a propaganda movie.
Yeah.
It's honestly a topic I love talking about because I find it really entertaining that people constantly view the word propaganda as a negative term, even though it's a neutral term.
Right.
And so to me, as I guess just to kind of open it up, what did you all make of this as pro Castro propaganda, kind of viewing it to the side of like what we're used to seeing, which is Western United States predominated propaganda.
Well, it's interesting, like when the movie takes place, because it's being made after the revolution, but it's set right before the revolution. And so much of what we're seeing is not the movie singing the praises of here's this new like government that we've put in place and all the great things it's doing for the people. It's kind of justifying just replacing the old government, which was just like obviously, just horrible for so many people in so many ways. One thing that maybe 2 points of comparison for this to other propaganda films that we could talk about would be like Man with a Movie Camera, which is a Soviet propaganda film that is just kind of like singing the praises of Soviet Russia and also doing the like real, dizzying visual inventiveness stuff. And then a movie like RRR from this year, where that movie has definitely like come under fire for the ways in which it is doing apologia for the current Indian government. But most of what you're actually seeing, or pretty much all of what you're actually seeing in the movie, is the same thing you're seeing in Soy Cuba, where we're like it's set in the past before that revolution happens, and we're kind of being given reasons why like people were motivated to do the revolution, right? I don't know if I would necessarily say any of these three is like better propaganda than the others, but I mean the decision of like when to set your movie and what you choose to focus on, I think really affects the way the audience is going to interpret like the propagandistic message of it.
Well, sure. To me, though, and I was just like reading some contemporary, but also just reviews around when it was restored in 1995. I mean, I read 2 of them to you. To me, it's just so interesting and ironic how film critics like sharpen their knives to attack this thing.
Yeah.
But then, Michael and I talked about the movie a number of weeks ago, but they just kind of are completely neutered to something like Top Gun,
right? Exactly,
or something, something like that is like, or Rocky, or something that's like just complete American propaganda. And that's what's always fascinating to me is just like, again, that's what like propaganda is not inherently a bad thing, but at the same time, why are we not critical of the propaganda that's being spewed to us on a monthly basis with a new Marvel movie or something like that? Just you watch something like Captain Marvel, which is just strong Air Force. You watch like Captain America, like it's just, that's kind of a fascinating thing to me.
I think the one difference between some of these that we're talking about and American propaganda films is that usually the propaganda is sort of in the background of the American propaganda films, right? I mean, I know Top Gun is like set in the Air Force, but
in Rocky, there's literally a Rocky sequel in which Rocky like smashes a Russian,
right? But it's all like limited to iconography, right? The movies are not really digging into the ideas of like why our group is good and why the other group is bad. We're just kind of like following this story of a character that we like are being told to be endeared to, and
I would just
waving the flag.
I would disagree with that, and because I think that there are different types of propaganda films, and America has all of them as well. Because you have a movie like let's take Zero Dark 30, right? Which had direct involvement from the CIA and to spin a particular narrative about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Like the war on terror. And that is a movie that is all about justifying a certain like set of actions that the U.S. military took. And is like very focused on the ideas. And I think that there is a good argument for that being a propaganda film and a really effective one too. And then on the other hand, you have something like Top Gun Maverick, which will not even mention countries that we're fighting against, actual political objectives, right? It is entirely abstracted. And the entire message is just American military good. And so I think like they happen in different ways. In the United States. And I mean, you've even got like some like counter propaganda stuff, like, or not you have like things in the United States, especially during the Cold War, that are like, like a movie like Dr. Zhivago, right? Is like, it's it was made in the time that it was made for a reason, right? You know, it's there to portray like the Russian Revolution as a tragedy on a certain level. And I mean, I know it's based on a novel and stuff like that, but I don't know. I guess it's not a British film, but regardless.
Yeah, well, but to Andrew's point also, and I think he brought up something interesting, is that we, at least in like modern terms, a lot of like you would like we're like this movie that we're talking about right now is targeted for being propaganda because it's relying more on cinematic language, and it's and people are more targeting like the content inside of it. I think that to Andrew's point that it's kind of in the background is that because a lot of Western, specifically American filmmaking, has become the dominant default for most of filmmaking today. At this point, it's we you can't even really tell how like the techniques
what's
being
propaganda
used.
and what's
Yeah,
not.
That's a
the
good
techniques
point.
being used for propaganda, and so that's what also makes it, I think more. I think to the audience's credit of not noticing it, that's what makes it tougher to notice because it's so like ingrained in
Right.
our psyche as being an acceptable form of movie making.
Like, isn't pretty much any movie that utilizes the iconography of the American military, like, don't they have to go through like an approval
Yes.
process?
If,
So like,
if they use the actual equipment that the military does,
if they use the equipment, yeah. So like the Michael Bay's Transformers movies are very much like working with the American military to show off all those like tanks and helicopters and stuff like that. But like no one would look at them and say they're propaganda films because like they're kind of like popcorn entertainment first and propaganda maybe like third, but like there's that level of propaganda sprinkled into so much of American entertainment to where like it's harder to point and sneer at, right?
Yeah.
No, and that's true, and that's why I brought up Marvel earlier. I mean, Marvel's gotten to that point. I haven't watched the full movie, but I've seen a lot of people writing about just how explicitly the military propaganda is in that movie. Where like I think she is
with Captain Marvel.
Yeah, she like
they even had there was an Air Force recruitment drive tied to that movie.
Yeah, and things like that, and I think also just the Marvel movies and their propaganda are kind of interesting. Not to completely derail us on a whole other thing, but there is just kind of like this idealistic American myth making. It's kind of, especially a through line through their first few phases. I still contend that the first Avengers movie is like a movie that was made so that it was like, hey, what if 9/11 happened but we won?
Yeah.
And so no, I think just the overall point that I'm trying to make is that that's what's so fascinating with movies today is that it's almost like you're criticizing a movie by calling it propaganda, and you're like, no, it's most movies have propaganda for something, whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it. And to getting back to Soy Cuba, I think it handles its propaganda better than most movies. I think it is pretty explicit about the message it's sharing, but like we talked about before, I think it's distributing it's distributing itself among these different stories in these different classes in a way that I don't know if you necessarily get that from another propaganda movie.
I will say that there were moments of the movie that I thought, like, just if I'm like looking at it from like an artfulness perspective, for instance, the end of the movie, which is the end of the last row where the guy joins the army and all that, like that, like I thought that was kind of like I thought it was pretty clunky, like how it transitions to like this kind of like almost newsreel montage of like, and then the revolution succeeded, and there are other parts of the movie where it feels like very artfully done. So I think that when Americans think of propaganda, or at least like if I think back to like how I was thought of propaganda, the very end of this movie is what they think of, where there's something directly looking at you on the screen saying, here is what you should think.
And now we're all going to join Fidel Castro, you know?
Right, exactly. And I think that, yes, like we're taught that that's bad because like, oh, you should be a free thinker, blah, 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 like whatever. But I think another reason that's implicit in why that's bad is that it's artless. And I think that there's like an undercurrent of like when people criticize propaganda, they're like, these sheep in this other country, they don't understand how dumb like the government thinks that they are because they can just put this trash on them. Like I see people talk about this with Chinese movies all the time, to be honest. Like where people kind of will critique how like the cheapness of the effects or things like that as like a backdoor into critiquing like how the government uses, you know, media in a kind of cheap way to, you know, just openly manipulate people. And I don't know. I mean, manipulation is often good in movies. But in terms of like the end of the movie is where like back of my brain, like, oh yeah, this is propaganda. Like that's when it was most triggered. And other parts of this movie I thought had such like cinematic energy that it didn't always register even as propaganda to me.
And it's just much more blunt as a story, that last chunk, than the others are. I feel like in the other sections, like the conflict is much more small scale. You get much more of a sense of these people as people. Whereas in the final story, it's like, you know, here's a guy. He like was victim to a bombing, and then he joined the military, and the revolution won. You know, I am glad I watched Soderbergh Shea movies in prep for this, because like we were saying in the first part about like the long drawn out process of what a revolution is actually like, that gets excised here, and we just kind of fast forward through that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing, not to get too deep in the weeds about like the history of American media towards Cuba, but like the American media is not giving you a good picture of Cuba. You know, I mentioned in the notes that like they point out like that. I think it was CI operative Roger Ebert saying that like they're suffering from these conditions, and you're like, well, yeah, they're suffering from the conditions because we're imposing all these sanctions on them.
Well, also, mid-90s, they were suffering from the fact that the Soviet Union had just collapsed. You know, if all of a sudden, you know, one of our major trade allies collapsed, like the United States would have some problems too.
Exactly. Look at what we're dealing right now with you know, the situation in Ukraine. Like, we're getting squeezed on stuff, and so that's always the kind of ironic thing in any discussion with Americans about Cuba, is that that's the kind of facet, you know, it's kind of like, yeah, if you know, if a river was flowing into your, you know, onto your land, and you like had fresh water and all that kind of stuff, you could do all this stuff with it, then yeah, you're doing great. But if somebody had the same land set up and the water was just cut off at the front, and so none of it was flowing in, yeah, you're gonna fucking suffer. And like that's what we're doing to them. But it's always the, you know, on the American side, I think of like when Fidel Castro died, the New York Times wrote this, you know, long story about Fidel Castro and how he was just, you know, making the long suffering people of Cuba suffer forever. And then like got quotes from the Cubans, but the Cubans were people at Versailles in Miami, Florida. So naturally they're going to be negative toward Castro because they left Cuba to be in Miami because they in their hearts are capitalist. Like, yeah, you're not going to get good quotes on that, you know? And so it's also like I'm willing to give this, it's propaganda like a large pass, just because I'm like, yeah, we do that shit constantly in terms of trying to describe this country.
Yeah,
right.
And I want to know what story like a country tells about themselves. Though of course this one's a little more complicated because it's a Russian filmmaker telling a story about Cuba. But yeah, I think that even if you are going to be critical of Cuba, and I'm sure there are reasons to be critical of the Castro administration, I don't know enough about it to be able to say, but you want to hear like what is their narrative, like that's part of the calculus, right?
Yeah. And there's always the nuance of like, yeah, there was probably a gazillion issues with the Castro administration. You know who also has a gazillion issues on a daily basis? Us.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
it's very rich. Like as soon as you get like films that are critical of America, or even like just discussion, I think about this all the time as an educator, because this is often where these lines are drawn. But you know, there's all this rhetoric about like we're teaching people to hate America if we say things that are negative about it, and it's like, well, how are you going to say that and then criticize other countries that like they're not allowed to think critically about like political dissent or something,
Right.
whatever.
No, we're a stupid country.
We are. I stand by that.
Any last thoughts on Soy Cuba?
I think after we've kind of mulled over the question of like what makes good propaganda, I think that two big qualities for me would be, is it honest? Like, is it being transparent about what it's propagandizing, as opposed to a lot of American propaganda, which like hides it, right? And just normalizes it through the hiding. And two, like, how good are the values it's propagandizing, right? Like propaganda, like Zach said, it's a neutral term. It could be used to argue for good things. It could be used to argue for evil things. Triumph of the will, propaganda, arguing for evil things. And so like that does come into account when you're deciding whether or not this is good propaganda. It might be effective, but is it good? Is it like a force for good in the world? That's what propaganda is. It is like celebrating or spreading a particular set of values. And so I don't know, most of the values that are being criticized, or like most of the arguments that are being made in Soy Cuba, feel pretty sound to me, like the ways in which it's talking about the way that ordinary people are kind of being left in the dust by these larger capitalist forces and larger military forces as they're being colonized, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, like when you talk about like, is the propaganda honest? Like I have no way of answering this question, but to what extent do let's say like in Nazi Germany, right? When someone watched Triumph of the Will, to what extent did someone sit down and think, I'm being propagandized to, or to what extent was it just since it was the of the moment thing happening, did they just perceive it as such? Because I think about like, there are people in America, and including some critics, who will look at a movie like Top Gun or something and say it is propaganda, but the vast majority of people do not, and because it is one, not telling us that it's propaganda, but two, also just kind of upholding what we're used to. But if you took that movie to, I don't know, like Afghanistan or something, would they feel the same way? They might more easily identify it as propaganda. I wonder if like a movie status as propaganda just becomes more obvious when you're not in that political milieu that it's like speaking to you within.
In some cases less obvious, because again, RRR, that movie is being perceived by largely white American audiences as being like really politically savvy, and it's being perceived by a lot of like Indian audiences as carrying water for a very cruel regime right now.
That's
and
true.
like if you don't have the context, you just can't see that.
Yeah, and I think on our level, like this is something that we talked about a number of weeks ago, but I don't think we're not training people to think critically about that. So I think it's easier for like an Afghan audience to be like, oh, this is American propaganda, because they probably are more preconditioned to be critical and negative toward America, rightfully so. And I'm sure we can all speak to it. We're conditioned to not, that you almost like it takes a while to decondition yourself from feeling bad about criticizing America, because you're so conditioned to think that's almost like the 11th commandment.
Well, we're also taught sort of implicitly not to see ideology at all, right? Yeah. Like there are things that are political and there are things that aren't political. And like if you don't mention like the name of a political party or the name of a politician, then it's not political. But like I don't think many people listening to the podcast need to be reminded of this, but like everything is political, right? Like everything you're seeing in a movie is like shaped by some sort of like larger political or cultural forces. And the way those things are being depicted is going to be like endorsing or rejecting the status quo about those things. And like just being able to see like the ideological underpinnings of any piece of media that you encounter is like just a valuable skill. And watching propaganda films is a good way to hone that skill, I think.
It's a good moral. Watch more propaganda.
and with that, we'll end with a nice moral. All right, well, that'll wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter and Instagram at handle @Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we list all the movies we talked about in the episode. If you would like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/Cinematary. Thank you so much to our supporters. Cam, Chad Newsom, Corey Willingham, Candace Sisson, Ron Hayes, Teresa Marsathi, Titus Arthur, and Tyler Chandler. Thank you so much for your patronage. Next week, we're going to continue our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with Pink Flamingos from 1972. So, getting back in the John Waters. The pun didn't really work as much as I thought it would. Taking a dive into the John Waters.
With our camera coated in a substance so that we don't come out with drops on us.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, we got, including that, we have 4 more episodes left of the series. So if you have not caught up, head over to cinematary.com. Under the podcast tab, we have all the episodes and videos there if you would like to catch up on an episode. Or you will go back and listen if you want to go and watch the movie along with us. So always recommended. But until then, thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Bye.